It began as an ordinary day in a busy public area, the kind of place where hundreds of people pass each other without ever truly seeing one another. In the middle of that crowd was a woman sitting quietly on the pavement, her head lowered, her voice barely audible as she asked strangers for help. To most people, she looked like just another unfortunate face in the crowd, someone whose story was too heavy to stop and listen to. But behind her tired eyes was a past that few could have imagined, a life that once held stability, respect, and hope before everything slowly fell apart. According to people who later came forward, the woman had not always lived this way. She had once been married, living what many would describe as a normal, respectable life. The marriage, however, did not survive. The divorce came after years of emotional strain, unmet expectations, and growing distance. When the relationship ended, it did not just take away a partner, it took away security, financial support, and the social standing she once relied on. Friends drifted away, family support weakened, and opportunities became harder to find. What followed was not an overnight collapse, but a slow and painful decline that pushed her closer to the streets. After the divorce, sources say she struggled to find steady work. With limited resources and mounting responsibilities, every small setback felt like a major blow. Rent became impossible to maintain, temporary jobs disappeared, and the emotional toll of isolation began to show. Pride kept her going for as long as it could, but reality eventually left her with no option but to ask strangers for help. For her, begging was not a choice, it was the final step after every other door had closed. On that particular day, witnesses noticed something different. There was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension that no one could quite explain at first. The woman continued her routine, holding out her hand without looking up, unaware that a moment from her past was walking straight toward her. People nearby later described how fate seemed to slow down, as if time itself was preparing for a collision that would shock everyone present. As the crowd moved, one man slowed his steps. He had noticed her from a distance, something about her presence pulling his attention despite the rush around him. The closer he came, the more unsettled he appeared. Those who observed the scene said his expression changed from casual distraction to disbelief. It was as though he was seeing a ghost from a life he thought was long gone. At that moment, the woman was still unaware of who stood just a few steps away. Her focus remained on survival, on getting through another hour, another day. The contrast between who she had been and who she was now could not have been more striking. Once a wife with dreams and plans, she now sat exposed to judgment, ignored by most, invisible to many. What no one around them knew yet was that this was not a random encounter. This was the first moment in years that two lives, separated by divorce and circumstances, were about to intersect again. The situation carried a weight far beyond what the eye could see. It was not just about poverty or regret, it was about consequences, choices, and the long shadows they cast. As the man stood there, frozen, the realization hit him fully. This was his former wife. The woman he had once shared a home with, made promises to, and planned a future alongside. Now she was sitting on the ground, begging. The shock of that reality was written clearly on his face, drawing the attention of people nearby who sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding. That single moment marked the beginning of a story that would soon leave everyone who witnessed it questioning how quickly life can change, how deeply divorce can impact lives, and how the past has a way of returning when least expected. The moment she finally looked up, everything changed. Her eyes met his, and for a brief second, confusion crossed her face before recognition settled in. Those who were close enough to notice said her hand trembled as she slowly lowered it. The world around her seemed to fade, replaced by a flood of memories she had spent years trying to bury. This was not just another passerby. This was the man who had once been her husband, standing there alive, successful, and composed, while she sat broken in front of him. Witnesses later described the silence that followed as heavy and uncomfortable. No words were spoken at first. The woman's expression shifted rapidly, moving from shock to disbelief, then to a quiet, almost painful awareness of her situation. She did not cry out, nor did she accuse him. Instead, she looked away, as if ashamed of being seen like this by someone who knew who she used to be. For her, the encounter was more than unexpected, it was devastating. The man, on the other hand, appeared unable to move. People nearby said he looked stunned, his face drained of color. This was clearly not a reunion he had ever imagined. He had known the marriage ended badly, but he had never pictured this outcome. Seeing her reduced to begging forced him to confront a reality he had long avoided. The past, which he thought had been neatly closed, was suddenly standing right in front of him. As seconds passed, the crowd began to notice the tension. Some slowed their steps, sensing that something deeply personal was unfolding. The woman kept her gaze low, her body language closed and defensive. Years of hardship had taught her to expect judgment, and seeing him there only intensified that feeling. She likely assumed he would turn away, just like so many others had done before. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost unsure. He called her name. That single word carried years of shared history, pain, and unresolved emotions. Hearing her name from his mouth again seemed to break something inside her. Witnesses said she nodded slightly but did not respond, as if words were no longer available to her. The contrast between them was impossible to ignore. He stood well-dressed, confident, clearly settled into a life that had moved forward. She sat on the ground, worn down by circumstances that had only grown harsher with time. The divorce had not affected them equally, and this moment exposed that imbalance in the most public way possible. It was a living reminder that endings do not distribute consequences fairly. According to those nearby, there was no argument, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, the encounter was marked by restraint and raw emotion. The woman seemed torn between wanting to explain herself and wanting to disappear entirely. Her silence spoke volumes. It reflected exhaustion, loss, and a deep sense of defeat. This was not how she wanted him to see her, yet fate had chosen this exact moment. The man asked simple questions. How long had she been there? Was she safe? Did she have anyone helping her? Each question seemed to carry regret beneath it. For the first time, he was forced to see the human cost of a relationship that ended without real closure. People watching could sense that this was not just about charity or sympathy, it was about responsibility and the weight of choices made years earlier. Her responses were short and restrained. She did not beg him directly, nor did she blame him. That restraint shocked many witnesses more than any emotional outburst would have. It showed a woman who had already accepted how low life had brought her, and who no longer expected fairness or rescue. The dignity she tried to maintain in that moment stood in painful contrast to her circumstances. As they spoke, the crowd slowly resumed its movement, but the atmosphere remained charged. Those who overheard fragments of the conversation later said it felt like watching two timelines collide. One had moved on, grown stronger, and found stability. The other had unraveled, burdened by loss and silence. This encounter exposed the hidden aftermath of divorce, something rarely discussed openly. What stood out most to witnesses was the man's reaction as the conversation continued. His initial shock began to give way to something deeper, an understanding that this was not just a coincidence, but a reckoning. The woman he once knew was still there, beneath the layers of hardship, and facing her like this forced him to confront truths he had long ignored. That meeting, brief yet intense, became the turning point of the story. It was no longer just about a woman begging on the street. It had become a moment that revealed how deeply lives can diverge after separation, and how the past, no matter how buried, can resurface in the most unexpected and unsettling ways. What happened next was something no one standing nearby expected. After a long pause, the man did not turn away, nor did he reach into his pocket and leave a few bills as most people would have done. Instead, he stayed. That simple decision alone changed the entire tone of the encounter. Those watching sensed that this moment was no longer about a chance meeting, but about something far deeper that demanded attention rather than avoidance. He lowered himself slightly to be closer to her eye level, an action that immediately drew quiet reactions from the people around. It was a subtle gesture, but one that signaled respect rather than pity. His voice remained calm as he continued speaking, no longer asking hurried questions, but listening carefully to her answers. For the first time in years, someone was not just hearing her situation, but truly acknowledging it. As the conversation went on, witnesses noticed a shift in the woman as well. Her shoulders, which had been tense and guarded, slowly relaxed. She spoke more openly about the events that followed the divorce, explaining how one difficulty led to another until she found herself with no support system left. There was no dramatic storytelling, only facts delivered with quiet honesty. This was not an attempt to gain sympathy, but an explanation of how life had unfolded when she had no safety net to fall back on. The man listened without interruption. Those nearby later said his expression reflected a growing realization that this was not a distant problem, but one directly connected to him. The separation, which he had treated as an ending, clearly had consequences that extended far beyond legal paperwork. Seeing her in this condition forced him to understand that moving on did not erase responsibility, especially when one person was left far more vulnerable than the other. Instead of offering empty words, he began discussing practical steps. He asked about her immediate needs, her health, and whether she had any place to stay. Each question suggested intention rather than impulse. People watching could sense that this was not a performative act meant to impress strangers, but a private decision unfolding in public. The sincerity of his approach made the situation even more striking. At one point, the woman hesitated, clearly unsure of what to expect. Years of disappointment had taught her not to trust sudden kindness. Yet his actions continued to break that pattern. He made calls, spoke briefly with someone on the other end, and then returned his attention to her. The crowd, now fully aware that something meaningful was happening, watched in silence. What followed left many observers deeply moved. He arranged temporary shelter for her and insisted she accept medical attention and proper food. There was no sense of control or superiority in his tone, only concern and responsibility. For the woman, this moment was overwhelming. Not because of the help itself, but because it came from the one person she least expected to stand by her again. Witnesses later said her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. Gratitude mixed with disbelief was written all over her face. This was not a dramatic reconciliation, nor a romantic reunion. It was something more complex and more real, a recognition of shared history and an acknowledgement of unfinished responsibility. As the situation concluded, people nearby began quietly discussing what they had just witnessed. Some spoke about the imbalance that often follows divorce, especially when one partner is left without resources or support. Others reflected on how easily society moves on from personal endings without considering long-term consequences. This moment had forced everyone present to confront uncomfortable truths. The man helped her to her feet before leaving, ensuring she was not left alone again. That final act, simple yet powerful, stayed with those who saw it. It was a reminder that compassion does not always come from strangers, and accountability does not end with separation. By the time they parted ways, the story had already begun spreading through whispered conversations and later online discussions. Many who heard about it described it as a lesson rather than a headline. A lesson about empathy, about responsibility, and about how life can change drastically for people who once stood on equal ground. In the end, this was not just a story about a divorced woman begging or a man encountering his past. It was a reminder that choices echo far longer than we expect, and that sometimes, facing those echoes is the most human act of all.